Welcome back everyone, another iPad comparison, and this is probably going to be the last one I do for a minute. And we're going to be comparing the iPad Pro 4th generation, the one that just came out like about a couple months ago, compared to the iPad 10.5 inch, the iPad Pro 10.5 inch. Now this was the second generation iPad. I reviewed it early on like this year. I think it was probably like February when I reviewed it. And I said at that point, I was like, dude, this tablet for the bang for buck value, it is such a good value of an iPad. And it even rivals the iPad Air 3, which kind of replaced it in a way. However, if you have all the money in the world, getting the iPad Pro 4th generation will definitely do you much better in the long run. That is a more future-proof tablet. You're getting much better cameras, screen, performance, battery life, all that stuff. You're getting a really, really good value out of the iPad Pro 4th gen, even though it's, noticeably more expensive. But I also think for a better bang per dollar standpoint, the iPad Pro 10.5 inch is an amazing way to go as well. It's so good. It's such a good tablet, and I love both these tablets a lot. Just the iPad Pro 4th gen is the newest one when it comes down to it. Now, when it comes down to the price tag, there is a little bit of difference. Obviously, there's a huge difference. I paid about $1,000 for my iPad Pro 4th generation. It is a 12.9 inch model, but there is a $799 model, which is really, really good. My iPad Pro 10.5 inch, I paid about $290, I think, in the used market. I think you can still pick these up on Amazon for pretty cheap too, so I'll find the cheapest ones on Amazon. I'll link them down in the description below so you guys can get them from there and help support the channel at the same time. Now, starting off with the iPad Pro 2nd gen, I'll go ahead and talk about the screens real quick. Now, that one actually came out in 2017, so not a super old tablet by any means. Now, that one has a 10.5 inch display on it. It is an IPS panel. It's 1668 by 2224, and I think it's a very good panel. You know what I mean? When this iPad came out, it was one of the first iPad, I think it was the first iPad that bring that 120 Hz refresh rate on that panel, which is really, really cool. That thing in and of itself kind of future-proofed this tablet so far ahead of all the other competitions. It's a super good tablet when it comes down to the screen. You have True Tone on that display as well. Now, the only slight problem with the display is not even the display itself, because I feel like this iPad and the iPad Pro 4th gen kind of have the same type of screen. It's just the bezel surrounding the screen that's kind of the difference. So on the iPad Pro 10.5 inch, we do have noticeably somewhat thick bezels around the display. It's not a deal breaker. It's not anything that's going to, you're going to cry about, but it is something to kind of consider that the iPad Pro 4th gen does look a little bit newer at the end of the day, you know what I mean? So, but as I've said before, I don't really even think a lot of people care that much. I think we're so used to kind of seeing like an older iPad, newer iPad, they kind of blend in, so it's not really that big of a deal. But just keep in mind that the iPad Pro 10.5 inch does have a little bit more bezel around the display compared to something like the iPad Pro 4th gen. Now, looking at the iPad Pro 4th gen, we have a 12.9 inch and 11 inch models for both respectively. They have IPS panels. The resolutions differ a little bit, but with the 12.9 inch model, we have a 2048 by 2732 resolution. And just like the other ones, we have True Tone. We have that 120 Hz refresh rate, which, like I've stated before, is a really cool thing. I love seeing that type of capability on a device like this, even on the 10.5 inch more so, but it's a really cool thing. It adds so much more smoothness, even though it doesn't make the device faster. It is so cool to see this type of technology on these type of iPads. So now the biggest thing about the iPad Pro 4th gen is the lack of bezel on the front. You have Face ID, you don't have any bezels for the you have bezels, but they're much smaller, and it just looks so futuristic. I mean, my MacBook that I'm looking at right now, my 15 inch model, has more bezel on it than my iPad does, which is crazy. So I think for sure the iPad Pro 4th gen has a lot going for it, and I literally love that so much. So the panel, the way it looks is better on the iPad Pro, the 4th generation one, but the 10.5 inch one still looks really good too. On the bottom, Lightning port on the iPad Pro 10.5 inch, USB Type-C on the iPad Pro 4th gen, and on the back, single camera setup on the 10.5 inch, and a dual camera plus LiDAR sensor, so kind of like a triple camera setup on the iPad Pro 4th generation. Now, when you're feeling both in the hands and everything, does one feel way premium than the other one? Not quite, but the iPad Pro 4th gen does feel a little bit cooler by having the flat sides on it, which are really cool. It's just one of those things that adds a little bit more flavor to the whole entire body of it, which I like. Now, I think the iPad Pro 10.5 inch still feels extremely good, and I think if you own the 10.5 inch iPad, you're going to be perfectly fine with it. It's not that big of a deal, but it is one of those things to consider at the end of the day. So in terms of the outside, that really pretty much covers it. Now, hitting on the software, this is where things get a little weird. Okay, so I will tell you, the way Apple goes and pushes software updates to their devices, whether you know it or not, isn't necessarily the year it came out or whatever the case. It's usually the chipset inside. So the iPhone 7, for example, had the Apple A10 Fusion chip. The iPad Pro 10.5 inch has the Apple A10X Fusion chip. So I'm not really too sure what that means. It might get an extra version of software on top of the iPhone 7. But regardless, the iPad Pro 4th gen has that Apple A12Z Bionic chip. So even though it's a couple generations ahead, it's still going to be getting more software support than the iPad Pro 10.5 inch. Now the main thing to keep in mind is that with that Apple A10X Fusion chip, it's supposed to be a little bit faster than the iPhone 7 and 7 Plus, which is really good. And because of the X at the end, I assume it's going to be getting iOS 15. If the iPhone 7 stops at iOS 14, it's probably going to be getting iOS 15, which is going to be really good, versus the iPad Pro 4th gen. It's just getting started with software updates. It's probably honestly going to last as long as the Apple A13 Bionic chip, so the iPhone 11 and 11 Pro. I wouldn't be surprised if those phones last as long as the iPad Pro or vice versa, just because the iPad Pro 4th gen has that newer Apple A12Z Bionic chip. So it is what it is. I'm not really too 100% sure, but if I had to say it, the iPad Pro 4th gen is definitely going to outlast the iPad Pro 10.5 inch. That's an easy one, but I'm not too sure how much longer it's going to last, so that pretty much covers it up in terms of software. Now hitting on the performance, on the iPad Pro 10.5 inch, we have that Apple A10X Fusion chip with 4 gigs of RAM on all the models, where on the iPad Pro 4th gen, we have that Apple A12Z Bionic chip and 6 gigs of RAM on all the models. Now, in terms of performance, I think that iPad Pro 10.5 inch is an extremely good performing iPad. Really, whatever I did with it was perfectly fine. There may have been some glitchiness here and there, but that 120Hz refresh rate really gives the impression that it's much faster than it is. Even though it's not faster, it's just smoother, which is really cool. So whenever I was doing anything with that iPad, games were perfectly fine and everything like that. It handled everything I threw at it perfectly fine, which is really cool. And, relating back to the use cases, if I was a student or something like that, or if I was, someone who was jotting down notes all the time and all that stuff, the iPad Pro 10.5 inch would be extremely good for me. I could, get to point A to point B extremely good. It has just as much RAM as phones like the iPhone 11 Pro and those type of phones. And trust me, at the end of the day, it's an extremely good performing tablet at the end of the day. But the iPad Pro 4th gen just kind of takes that to another level. We have that A12Z Bionic chip, which is really cool. We have that 6GB of RAM option, which is 50% more RAM than the iPad Pro 2nd gen. And I think, if you're going to go down to it and get into the nitty gritty and all that, for sure at the end of the day, the iPad Pro is the faster one. The iPad Pro 4th gen is faster than the 2nd gen by all means. I mean, it's a no-brainer. But I still think the 2nd gen has a lot to offer. And I think, it's still a very good pickup for a lot of people. Now, I'm sure it's not going to be the main priority for a lot of people. I'm sure it's not going to be the first, iPad people flock to, mostly because it's not even available at the Apple stores anymore. But I think for a majority of people, the iPad Pro 2nd gen is more than enough when it comes down to the performance, but the 4th gen does take it to the next level. Games run smoother on it. You're able to multitask faster. You're even able to store more apps in the background, which is really cool. So it is what it is, but that's kind of the one thing I would say at the end of the day. So in terms of the performance, that pretty much covers it. Now hitting on the cameras, we have a single 12 megapixel sensor on the iPad Pro 2nd gen. And like I said, a dual camera setup with an additional LiDAR sensor on the iPad Pro 4th gen, a 12 megapixel wide angle lens, a 10 megapixel ultra wide sensor, and then that 3D LiDAR sensor. And we can do 4K at 30 on both, but we can do 4K at 60 on the iPad Pro 4th gen, which is really cool. Now when it comes down to it, again, this is no-brainer. The iPad Pro 4th gen does have the better capability of taking better photos and all that. You also have that additional LiDAR sensor, which is really cool. Now, whether you use it or not, you have that capability. I feel like with iPadOS 14, it's going to start taking a lot of capability into AR. And essentially, it's going to make it so, that LiDAR sensor will become more useful. It kind of is already, but in the future, I'm sure it'll go up even more. So on the front, 7 megapixel sensors on both, 1080p at 30, but you do have the capability of doing 1080p at 60 on the iPad Pro 4th gen, which is really cool. So when it comes down to it, the iPad Pro definitely wins there. Now ending it off with the battery life, the iPad Pro 2nd gen has a 8,134 mAh battery. The iPad Pro 12.9 inch has a 9,720 mAh battery. And again, I don't think one necessarily blows the other one out of the water here, but if I had to say it, quite potentially the iPad Pro 10.5 inch might have the better battery life. I know it has a better battery life over the 11 inch model, but the 12.9 inch model, it kind of goes hand in hand, Maybe the 12.9 inch model is a little bit better, but still, it's pretty neck and neck. And the 10.5 inch one, I had pretty good battery life when I was using it. Now, to kind of sum up the video and to answer the comparison, which one should you pick up in 2020? Now, honestly, like I said before, if you have all the money in the world, getting the iPad Pro 12.9 inch, the 4th gen model, or the 11 inch model will do you much better. It's going to get you from, it's going to make you so happy, I'm not going to lie. But the iPad Pro 2nd gen, the 10.9 inch model, 10.5 inch model, still has so much going for it. I don't think you're going to find a lot of tablets out there that, compete with even that specific iPad that came out in 2017. It's still good enough for a lot of people out there. And if you're on a budget, getting an iPad like that will save you a bunch of money, and you won't necessarily feel like you're missing out on too much, which is one of its biggest highlights. So in terms of comparison, that really pretty much covers it. If you guys have any other questions or anything like that, let me know in the comment section below. Hit the like button, that means so much, but definitely hit that subscribe button. Every single subscriber that we get really does count, so it means so much if you guys could hit that. Also, check out the other links down in the description as well. My Twitter, my Instagram, my second channel, all those links are linked down below. I'd really appreciate if you guys would check it out. More importantly than everything else, I love every single one of you guys. Hopefully I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace out till then.